Good morning, everyone. We appreciate you being here today. It is time to begin. They rang the bell, so we're going to get started here today in just a moment. Our handouts available if you'd like to follow along, and we're going to be looking at our 8th lesson in our study of Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is a little different for me today because we had the Sunday that we weren't meeting because of the freeze, and so I compressed 3 lessons into 2 lessons. But then this week, I heard that our children's classes, because there were only 12 Sundays in this past quarter, and there's going to be 14 in the other quarter, the material that they're studying, I was told, is written to where March the 1st, which is a Sunday, is going to still be the last lesson in their winter quarter. Okay, I've lost myself. I hope I didn't lose you. So what I think is going to happen is that I'm going to make this lesson that I was going to try to get done, and it was probably a hopeless cause, into 1 lesson. I'm going to probably break it back out the way I had originally intended to do that. So we'll see. If I need to start in the next one, I will. But if that's the case, then the handout that you have is only going to be 1 page today, because when I compressed it, I put them all into that front and back. So you may only have to fill out 1 side this morning. But we'll see how it goes as we get started and we continue our study. But likely we will conclude our study of Ezra and Nehemiah on March the 1st, which will allow those of you who are going to start to teach next quarter to be here through the last lesson, and also those who are teaching currently will be able to be a part of our beginning of a new study. And so I didn't realize that was going to happen until this week. But anyway, that's the goal at the moment, at least. As we continue to think about our study of Ezra and Nehemiah, today the main idea that we're going to consider is a heart for the homeland. And we began looking at this desire of Nehemiah's last week. And so we're going to review that, what leads us up to the point where we'll start looking at some things taking place back in Jerusalem once Nehemiah arrives there. But by way of reminder of the setting, we go back to Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where we read the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some of the men. And I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. And they said to me, those who survived the exiles and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And so we saw this situation with Nehemiah last week. As we get to where we are in history, we remember, by way of background, that in Ezra chapter 1, we read about the opportunity that was given to the exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Helbig Smith in his narrated Bible said the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, comes in 539 to 538 BC. And quoting Helbig Smith, he says, within 2 years, in 536 BC, the initial resettlement has been completed and the foundation of the temple laid. 70 years after the first deportation, in 606 BC. However, restoration will not be easy, and they immediately began to encounter opposition. And so we saw that, as was prophesied when they were taken away into exile, 70 years is when there will be a return to Jerusalem. And so Ezra picks us up with the decree being made by Cyrus. They come back to Jerusalem. We remember they got the foundation laid. In Ezra chapter 4 and verse 4, we read, "Then the people around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building." And so we saw that here they get back. There's excitement being back in Jerusalem. They begin the work. They get the foundation laid, and then opposition rises. Discouragement sets in, and they stop. And the enemy opposition actually resulted in some official persecution and governmental persecution, and ultimately the rebuilding was halted for some 15 to 16 years. In Ezra chapter 4, verse 24, we read, "Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." And so now we're at 522 BC, and Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets of God that we're familiar with, come and they prophesy to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in Ezra chapter 5, 1 and 2. And so Zerubbabel, who led that first group back to Jerusalem, he again rallies the people and they begin the work of rebuilding God's temple in Jerusalem. And so after great opposition and great frustration, the temple is finally rebuilt in 516 BC, Ezra chapter 6, verse 15. And so just like it was 70 years that elapsed from the very first deportation to the return of the first settlers, it's now been 70 years since the Temple of Solomon was destroyed in 586 BC until when that temple has been now rebuilt 70 years later. And so we've seen all of that, but just wanted to kind of recap to get our situation, our current situation and the setting of what's taking place. Now, currently, we're about 70 years after that first return. So there were 70 years that they were in exile. Now we're about 70 years after the first of the remnant returned. So we're around 445 BC when Nehemiah gets a troubling message that the exiles back in Jerusalem are discouraged and distressed because further rebuilding of Jerusalem has been hampered and the walls and the gates of the city are in ruin. Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we see that setting where he gets that word from his brethren, and it makes him very sad to hear this news. And so, as we mentioned last week, just want to quickly review, there is disagreement over the cause of the present devastation of the walls of Jerusalem. And so you have some who argue that the walls of Jerusalem had been rebuilt. We have the temple had been rebuilt, we know that, and we know that the building process was taking place. In Ezra chapter 4, verse 12, they were restoring the walls and repairing the foundation of the temple. So there was some restoration going on. And so some believe that they completed the restoration of the walls of Jerusalem as well. And so somewhere during this 70-year period between their coming back and then the things that are taking place, somewhere during that period of time, they believe there was another destruction that took place. Some of their enemies would have come in and torn down the walls and burned the walls. But if that's the case, they didn't tear down the temple at that time. Others argue that the walls never did get completed, okay? So the temple gets restored. They had done some work on the walls, but just like their distractions that we've seen over and over and over, some believe that they got distracted and they just never did rebuild those walls completely. And as the walls sat there, they just continued to deteriorate. And so some believe that that was still a result of what now would have been 140 years earlier when those walls and that temple and all would have been destroyed. Either way, the result is great sorrow for Nehemiah, okay? Whatever the cause, whether it was a more recent destruction, which some will argue and be adamant about, or whether it was the original destruction, which some will argue and be adamant about, either way, the result is when Nehemiah hears that, it gives him great sadness. And so in Nehemiah 1, 1-4, we find him sitting down, weeping, mourning, fasting before God, and praying. And so last week we looked at the opportunity that was placed before Nehemiah. And we saw this in chapter 2, verses 1 through 8 there. And we'll quickly look at that again. It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine, gave it to the king. I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad since you're not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Then the king said to me, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. Furthermore, I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me for the governors of the region beyond the river, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the houses that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. And so here we see, again, God doing more than what can be imagined there, where the king allows Nehemiah not only to return, he gives him permission to pass through any area he needs to pass through, and he gave him permission to receive the timber that he needed in the building process. And so we saw all of this. So now today we're going to pick up where Nehemiah is now in Jerusalem. He has led this third exile group returning to Jerusalem, and he's picking up where things had been left off. And so when he gets there, as we're thinking about the hearts of the people that he encounters when he comes back. And so he comes back with this great excitement. We're going to go and we're going to make things right. We're going to get the city. We're going to get the walls in order. And when he came back, the reaction that he received from the people was that some were ready to work. Some were ready to work. Look with me at chapter 2 of Nehemiah, verses 17 and 18. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God upon me and what the king has said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work. Now, a couple of things come to my mind when we think of this. First, it's exciting for somebody to come back with excitement and with a plan that we're going to do what we needed to be done a long time ago. We're going to get these things all straightened out. And he comes in and he actually has a positive response, okay? You know, he could have come in and he could have said this, and they could have all looked at him like, no, it's not going to happen, and here's why. But so the people are excited. Now, the other thing that comes to my mind is some of these people had been looking at those walls for years. They had been looking at those walls for years, and they knew that those walls needed to be rebuilt, yet for whatever reason they had decided that they weren't going to take up the task, okay? So there'd been people there that could have been working on those walls, and they weren't. And so here we find somebody coming in and building up that excitement and getting the people inspired for the task. It reminded me, years ago, I got a call from an elder in a nearby town, and I had the opportunity to help fill in when they were in between preachers one time for a while, and had built a good relationship with, knew a lot of the people there. And he called me up and he says, John said, we want you to come on this date, and we're going to have a special day focused on families and on our young people and trying to motivate. And he went on and gave me the spiel about what they were wanting to accomplish that day. And I said, well, I'd be happy to come help you. And then he said, John, we need an expert. And I just laughed. And I told him, I said, brother, if you need an expert, I'm not the one you need. And he laughed. He said, John, you know what an expert is? He said, it's somebody who comes in from out of town and he carries a briefcase. I said, well, I can do that. I'll have to borrow a briefcase if I need one, but can I bring a backpack instead? And he just laughed. He says, no, that was the mentality. So here, somebody, their local preacher may have preached this same thing that I'm going to come say many times, yet sometimes when you bring somebody in from outside and they say it, it's like, I remember taking young people one time to a youth conference. And I had really been trying to work on this group about certain things. And it was a small group. And I took them to this youth meeting where some guy that they had never heard before got up and was a lot more dynamic than I am. And that person started saying some of the exact same things we had been studying. And I vividly remember one of the teens turning and just staring at me. He just looks at me like, I've heard this before. And it was amazing. It's like, hey, John actually said this. It's like, yeah, he's reading from the same Bible we were reading from, okay? And so, but here we have, so Nehemiah comes back in and gets the people excited. Let's start rebuilding. Yes, it's long overdue. And so they start. Look at Nehemiah chapter 3 with me. We're not going to take time to read all of Nehemiah chapter 3, but I want you to notice some things that are very, very powerful there. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brethren, the priest, and built the sheep gate. So here we find the priests are hands-on, aren't they? Okay? They're not just standing back wanting to be served. They're hands-on. They consecrated it, hung its doors. They built as far as the Tower of the 100 and consecrated it then as far as the Tower of Hananel. Next to Eliashib, the men of Jericho built. And next to them, drop down to verse 4. And next to them, the end of verse 4 says, and next to them. Verse 5, next to them. Verse 7, and next to them. Verse 8, next to him. Later in verse 8, next to him. Verse 9, next to him. Verse 10, next to them. You can keep going all the way through the chapter. And what you have is a list of families who are hands-on, working on the wall, and next to them is this family, and next to them is this family, next to them. You know what that's like. We have youth activities where we have groups of people that are responsible. There was a Valentine's party for our younger kids last night, and in the preparation for that, we had this family, and next to them was this family, and here were the workers that were together making these things happen. There's the fellowship for the widows and widowers today, and that room is beautiful, but it took somebody working and somebody next to them making those kinds of things happen. And we see that constantly in the body of Christ. The work of the Lord is work that he has for each one of us. And so these words paint images of those hands-on activities. And so we think about that in comparison to the body of Christ and what all takes place for the body of Christ to function. There's shepherding, and there's fishing, and there's sowing, and there's watering, and there's building. And it takes all of this things happening in cooperation. And so here we see every family was essential to the rebuilding of the walls, just like every family is essential to the building of the body of Christ. Look over with me. Come back. We're going to come back to Nehemiah. Keep your place there. But turn over to Ephesians 4 with me. Thought I wanted to include that this morning. Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting. But speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. There you see the picture of what we see in Nehemiah chapter 3 with the church. Everybody has something that they're able to do and something that they're able to contribute. We all have talents. We all have abilities. They're not all the same. But we work together with what we supply to the body of Christ, and the body of Christ is stronger than it would be without us contributing our part. And so here we see in Nehemiah chapter 3, the people gather together side by side, working to bring about the accomplishment of the task. So some were ready to work, and that's exciting. It's exciting when something is planned and you find the people ready to go to it. But just like those who were ready to work, there were also some who were ready to ridicule. Okay? There were some who were ready to ridicule. Look at chapter 2 of Nehemiah, this time verse 10, and then we're going to drop down to verse 19. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. Now go to chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what they are building, if even a fox climbed up on it, he would break down their wall of stones. And so in chapter 4 and verse 5, we read about Sanballat and Tobiah. They have thrown insults in the face of the builders. That could be translated, they have demoralized or they have discouraged the builders. Ever encountered some Sanballats and Tobiahs? When you've got good heart and good desire and good effort for the kingdom, and you get those who are excited about it, and then all of a sudden you get those who have nothing but criticism and can'ts that they introduce. It happens, okay? In any project, it may happen in your job, but it definitely happens even in the body of Christ because we're people. In every good effort, we may encounter a few folks like Sanballat and Tobiah, those who opt to tear down and discourage rather than put their hearts and their hands to the task, okay? And so rather than just joining in with that great cooperation that was taking place, they decided to try to discourage what was taking place. As I was thinking through this again, a sweet memory came to my mind. When my daughter Claudia was about first or second grade, I guess, somewhere in that age area, she came from her Bible class, and we sat down on our pew getting ready for worship, and I said, what'd y'all do in Bible class today? And so she pulled out her handwork, and she showed me that they had learned about Sanballat and Tobiah. But she looked at me, and she says, but Daddy said, I called him Sanballat because he was a bad man. And she just giggled and giggled and giggled. So I cannot read Sanballat without her pronunciation of Sanballat and thinking that she had just really nailed him, because of that. So you You can remember that Sanballat was a Sanballat because of that too, as well. And so here we have. You have the people ready to work, hearts of the people ready to work. Some were ready to ridicule. So where do we go from here? Well, in the past, we've seen that it had delayed a lot of things. We saw after the foundation was built, the temple got delayed for about 15, 16 years. And then they got back in work. And now we see that 70 years later, there's still things that need to be done that haven't been done. And so as we think about Nehemiah's message, we find the heart to overcome opposition. And so the people had this willingness to work. Now they have to really have a heart to work to continue in the midst of this opposition. So in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 6, we read, so we rebuilt the wall. Here, Sanballat and Tobiah are trying to discourage the work. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. So in the midst of all this, they kept building, and they got all of the wall built to half its height. Okay, and so they're making this progress. And so while others tried to demoralize and insult, Nehemiah and the people continued to work. That made me think about a passage in Matthew chapter 11, where Jesus is talking about John the Baptist. We find a situation where John the Baptist had sent a message to Jesus asking, are you the one? He's in prison. Are you the one, or should we look for another? And, and that sounds like a big struggle of faith, but, all Jesus said was, go back and tell him what you see and hear. That the lame walk and the sick are healed, and all of these things that John the Baptist knew were the things that told us about the one who was coming and what he was going to do. And then he talked to the people. He says, when you went out to go see John, what did you go out to see? And basically, did you go out to see a soft guy that was just a yes man for the king? No. You went out to see a prophet. And I say more than a prophet of God. And Jesus even said, among those born of woman, there is none greater than John the Baptist. I mean, he did what he was sent here to do, what his purpose was from the womb. John the Baptist, before the womb, John the Baptist came to accomplish. And so then Jesus throws out another little saying, but the least in the kingdom is greater than he. Well, there's nobody born greater, but the least in the kingdom is greater. Well, John was going to be beheaded before the kingdom came into being and power, before the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. But he fulfilled his purpose. And then as